There's a counterintuitive truth about human conflict that could save your life, your relationships, and your sanity. The most psychologically evolved people know exactly when not to defend themselves. Not because they're weak, not because they're pushovers, but because they understand something profound about the nature of defense itself. Allan Watts discovered that defending yourself in certain situations doesn't protect you, it destroys you. It feeds the very thing attacking you. It validates the game you should be refusing to play. I'm about to reveal the 10 dangerous situations where defending yourself is the worst possible strategy, why Watts believed that the ego's need to defend is often the source of the attack itself, and why learning when not to defend yourself is the most powerful form of self-protection you'll ever master. If you've been in situations where defending yourself somehow made everything worse, where explaining yourself created more misunderstanding, where proving you were right somehow made you lose, Watts would say you encountered one of these 10 situations. You were playing a game that can't be won through defense because the act of defending is exactly what the game needs to continue. Here's what Watts understood that changes everything. Most of what we call self-defense is actually ego defense, and the ego defending itself is like a fire trying to put itself out with gasoline. The ego, what Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego, the illusion of being a separate, isolated self, is constantly under threat. Or rather, it perceives constant threat. And its primary response is defense. Defend your reputation. Defend your beliefs. Defend your actions. Defend your worth. Defend, defend, defend. But here's the cosmic joke Watts saw clearly. The more you defend the ego, the more real you make it. The more you protect the illusion, the more imprisoned you become within it. There are 10 specific situations where defending yourself is psychological suicide, where the act of defense feeds the attack, where protection becomes self-destruction, where the only winning move is not to play. Watts didn't mean you should become a doormat. He meant you should become so psychologically integrated that certain attacks simply pass through you like light through glass, because there's nothing there to defend. These aren't abstract spiritual concepts. These are practical situations you face regularly. And learning to recognize them could be the difference between psychological freedom and a lifetime of unnecessary suffering. Here's what Watts understood that most people miss. When someone is projecting their own unconscious material onto you, defending yourself validates their projection and makes it more real. Projection is when someone takes their own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or qualities and attributes them to you. They're angry but can't admit it, so they accuse you of being angry. They're dishonest but won't face it, so they call you a liar. They're controlling but it's unconscious, so they experience you as controlling them. This is psychological projection, and it's happening constantly in human interactions. Here's the trap. When someone projects onto you, your first instinct is to defend yourself. No, I'm not angry. I didn't lie. I'm not trying to control you. But Watts saw that this defense does something devastating. It accepts the premise of the projection. By defending against the accusation, you're implicitly agreeing that, if you were those things, it would be a problem that needs defending against. You're entering the game. You're making the projection real by treating it as something that requires a response. Watts experienced this personally in his lectures. Someone would accuse him of being elitist for teaching Eastern philosophy. If he'd defended himself, "No, I'm not elitist, I'm trying to make this accessible," he would have validated their projection. Instead, he'd often respond with something like, "Interesting, what makes you experience it that way?" He refused to defend because he understood that their accusation was about their own feelings of inadequacy, not about his actual intentions. Defending would have made their projection his problem. This is dangerous because your defense becomes evidence. When you defend yourself against a projection, the projector thinks, "See, they're getting defensive. That proves I'm right." Your defense is interpreted as guilt, as proof of exactly what they're accusing you of. It's a psychological trap where any move you make confirms their belief. One of Watts's students described this perfectly. "My mother would accuse me of being selfish whenever I set boundaries. For years I'd defend myself. I'm not selfish. I just need some space. But my defense only made her more convinced I was selfish because I was putting myself first, even in the conversation. Then I learned from Watts to simply not defend. She'd say I was selfish, and I'd say, I can see you feel that way. No defense, no argument, just acknowledgement. At first she escalated, trying to get me to defend myself. But when I consistently refused to play, the projection lost its power. She couldn't maintain it without my participation. The deeper truth Watts saw: projection is the projector's unconscious material trying to become conscious. They're seeing in you what they can't see in themselves. Your defense prevents them from confronting their own shadow. By not defending, you're actually giving them the opportunity, though they might not take it, to recognize what's really happening. But here's what makes this situation truly dangerous. Chronic defense against projection gradually makes you become what you're defending against. If you spend years defending yourself against accusations of being angry, selfish, or controlling, you develop a compensatory identity. You become someone who must constantly prove they're not those things. And that compensatory identity is just as false and limiting as the projection itself. You've allowed someone else's unconscious material to shape who you become. Watts would say the liberated response is, let the projection pass through you. Don't resist it. Don't defend against it. Don't absorb it. Just let it be what it is. Their material, their process, their unconscious speaking. You're not obligated to defend against someone else's hallucination. You're not required to argue with their dream of you. The practical application is this: when someone accuses you of something that feels fundamentally untrue, something that doesn't match your internal experience or self-knowledge, don't defend. Pause. Feel into whether this is projection. Ask yourself, is this really about me, or is this about something in them they can't face? If it's projection, your defense will only feed it. The most powerful response is presence without defense, acknowledgement without agreement. I hear that's your experience without, but let me explain why you're wrong. This doesn't mean you never clarify misunderstandings. It means you distinguish between genuine misunderstanding, which can be clarified, and projection, which can't be argued away because it's not about you in the first place. When someone is projecting, defending yourself is like trying to convince someone they're not dreaming while they're still asleep. It's impossible and unnecessary. The dream will end on its own when they wake up. Your job is not to participate in it. Watts's second insight: some people are not attacking you because of who you are. They're attacking you because they need an opponent to maintain their psychological drama. This is crucial to understand. There are people who exist in a perpetual state of conflict, not because the world is against them, but because conflict is how they feel alive, how they maintain their identity, how they avoid facing deeper emptiness or pain. They need drama like an addict needs a fix. And if you defend yourself, you become their supply. Watts called this the game of black and white. These people need opposition to feel real. They need someone to argue with, someone to prove wrong, someone to defeat. It's not personal. You're just the current casting in their ongoing drama. If it wasn't you, it would be someone else. The content of the conflict is irrelevant. The conflict itself is the point. Here's the trap. When someone tries to pull you into their drama by attacking you, defending yourself is exactly what they want. Your defense gives them the opponent they need. Your explanation gives them something to argue against. Your attempt to prove them wrong gives them the conflict that makes them feel alive. You're feeding the drama by participating in it. Watts illustrated this with a perfect metaphor. Imagine someone walks up to you and says, "Let's have a war." If you say no, we shouldn't fight, you've already entered the war. You're arguing about whether to argue. You've accepted the premise that this is a conflict that needs resolving. But if you simply say, "I'm not interested in war," and walk away, there's no war. It takes two to fight. Drama requires participation. One of Watts's most powerful teachings was about recognizing drama addicts. He described them as people who start fires so they can be firefighters. They create crisis, then heroically manage the crisis, then feel valuable because they're managing crisis. If you try to prevent the crisis by defending yourself or explaining rationally, you become part of their crisis creation machine. Your defense is just more fuel for the fire they need to keep burning. This situation is dangerous because defending yourself gives them exactly what they're unconsciously seeking: your energy, your attention, your participation in their drama. And here's the insidious part: they will escalate until you engage. If a small attack doesn't pull you in, they'll launch a bigger one. If that doesn't work, they'll try a different angle. They're not trying to understand you or resolve anything. They're trying to get you to fight. A student of Watts described recognizing this pattern. I had a colleague who constantly created conflict. She'd misinterpret my emails, accuse me of undermining her, create elaborate scenarios where I was the villain. For months I'd defend myself, write detailed explanations, provide evidence that I hadn't done what she claimed. But somehow my defense always made it worse. She'd twist my words, find new things to attack, escalate the drama. Then I realized she didn't want resolution. She wanted conflict. So I stopped defending. When she'd accuse me, I'd say, "I'm sorry you experienced it that way," and nothing more. She escalated temporarily, trying to pull me back in. But when I consistently refused to defend or engage, she eventually moved on to someone else who would play. The deeper pattern Watts identified. Drama addiction is usually covering a deep inner emptiness. These people can't tolerate silence, peace, or their own inner experience. They need external chaos to avoid internal stillness. Your defense doesn't address this underlying issue. It becomes part of the external chaos they're using to avoid themselves. Watts would say the compassionate response is to refuse to be their opponent. Not from superiority or judgment, but from clarity. You're not rejecting them, you're rejecting the game. You're saying, "I see you need conflict, but I'm not available to provide it." This is actually more loving than participating in their drama, because participation enables their avoidance of what they really need to face. The practical application: when someone's attack feels disproportionate, irrational, or disconnected from reality, when you sense they're not actually responding to you, but to some internal need, don't defend. Defending is agreeing to be their opponent. Instead, stay calm, stay present, and refuse to engage with the drama. I hear you're upset. I'm not going to argue about this. Then stop. Don't explain. Don't justify. Don't defend. Just stop. This takes tremendous discipline, because the ego wants to defend. It feels unfair to be accused falsely. It feels wrong to let someone misrepresent you. But Watts would ask, what's more important, being understood by someone who's determined to misunderstand you, or maintaining your own peace? You can't force someone out of their drama. You can only refuse to participate in it. Here's what Watts understood about strategic silence. Sometimes the act of defense gives away more than the original attack could have discovered. This is a practical, almost tactical situation that Watts observed in interpersonal dynamics. When someone accuses you of something, especially something vague or partially true, your defensive response often fills in details they didn't actually know. Your defense becomes a confession or a roadmap to your vulnerabilities. Watts illustrated this with an ancient Zen story. A monk was accused of fathering a child. Instead of defending himself, he was actually celibate. He simply said, "Is that so?" and took responsibility for the child. Years later, the truth came out. He wasn't the father. Someone asked why he didn't defend himself. He said, "Because my defense would have harmed someone else who needed protection." His silence protected information that was more important than his reputation. This is dangerous because your ego's need to defend can override your strategic wisdom. Someone makes a vague accusation, and in your rush to defend yourself, you provide details, context, or information that actually makes the situation worse. You're so focused on clearing your name that you don't realize you're revealing things that should remain private. One of Watts's friends, a businessman, described this perfectly. A competitor implied at a conference that my company was struggling financially. My first instinct was to defend, to explain our actual financial situation, to prove him wrong with details. But something in me paused. I remembered Watts's teaching about unnecessary defense. So I just said, "That's interesting speculation," and moved on. Later I realized that defending would have required me to reveal actual financial information, some of it proprietary, that my competitor was fishing for. His accusation was bait. My defense would have been the catch. The deeper pattern Watts saw. Many accusations are actually fishing expeditions. Someone throws out a vague claim to see how you respond. Your defensive explanation gives them information they wouldn't otherwise have access to. They're not actually accusing you, they're interviewing you without your realizing it. This happens constantly in personal relationships too. Someone says, "You seem distant lately." If you defend yourself by explaining where you've been and what you've been doing, you might reveal information about your private life that they had no right to know but were curious about. The accusation was just a way to extract information. Your defense handed it over. Watts would say this requires a kind of psychological judo, using the force of the attack by redirecting it rather than meeting it with opposing force. Someone accuses you vaguely, you respond vaguely. "I appreciate your concern," no explanation, no defense, no information transfer. The attack passes through without landing because you didn't provide the leverage point of defense. This situation is particularly dangerous in professional contexts. In negotiations, legal situations, workplace conflicts, defending yourself often reveals your strategy, your weaknesses, your concerns. Experienced manipulators use accusations specifically to extract this information. They don't care if the accusation is true. They care about what your defense reveals about your thinking, your vulnerabilities, your position. A lawyer who studied Watts's teachings described applying this. In depositions, opposing counsel will make accusations designed to provoke defensive responses. "Your client clearly knew about X," they'll say, hoping you'll jump to defend. But in defending, "No, they only learned about X after Y happened. You've just confirmed Y happened and provided a timeline. I learned to respond with minimal information. I disagree with that characterization. Nothing more." Don't defend, don't explain, don't provide the information they're fishing for. The practical wisdom: before you defend yourself, ask, what information would my defense reveal? Is that information something I want to make available? Often you'll realize that the accusation is less damaging than the defense would be. The accusation is just words. Your defense would be confirmation, details, roadmaps. Watts would add a spiritual dimension to this. Sometimes people need to believe false things about you as part of their own journey. Their misunderstanding might be serving some purpose in their development. Your defense might actually prevent them from learning something they need to learn through being wrong about you. Your silence becomes a gift. You let them have their misconception until they're ready to see clearly. This doesn't mean you never clarify or explain. It means you become strategic about when defense is actually helpful versus when it's giving away leverage, power, or information. Some accusations are best met with silence, not because you're guilty, but because you're wise. Not because you can't defend, but because you know when defense costs more than the accusation. The Zen masters Watts studied had a saying, "Not explaining is a kind of explaining." When you don't defend yourself, you're making a statement that the accusation is beneath response or irrelevant, or the accuser's problem rather than yours. This non-defense communicates more strength than any explanation could. Watts's fourth insight touches on a psychological paradox. The more vehemently you defend your innocence, the more guilty you appear. There's a perverse dynamic in human psychology where excessive defense triggers suspicion. When someone is accused of something and immediately launches into elaborate explanations, justifications, and proofs of innocence, observers often think, why are they trying so hard? What are they hiding? The defense itself becomes evidence of guilt. Watts understood this from studying human behavior. He noticed that truly innocent people often have a kind of bemused quality. when accused falsely. They're almost confused by the accusation because it's so disconnected from their reality. They might say, "That's not accurate," and then move on. But guilty people, or innocent people who've internalized guilt, over-explain. They provide excessive detail. They defend against accusations that haven't even been made yet. This is the trap Shakespeare described. The lady doth protest too much. Your excessive defense signals that there's something to defend against. If you were truly innocent, truly clean, truly unbothered, you wouldn't need such elaborate defense. The defense reveals the wound. One of Watts's observations from his own life: when he was accused of things that were completely false, he felt no need to defend. The accusation was so absurd, it didn't require response. But when accused of something that touched on actual insecurity or partial truth, he'd feel the urge to over-explain. The defensive impulse itself revealed where he wasn't fully integrated, where he still had unconscious guilt or shame. This situation is dangerous because your ego doesn't distinguish between false accusations and true ones. It just feels attacked and responds with defense. Even when you're completely innocent, if the accusation touches on something you're insecure about, you'll defend too much, and that excessive defense makes you look guilty of something, even if it's not what you were accused of. A therapist who studied Watts described this pattern in couples counseling. When one partner accuses the other of something, say, emotional unavailability, the accused often goes into elaborate defense. "I'm not emotionally unavailable. Remember when I did X and Y and Z?" The more they defend, the more emotionally unavailable they appear in that moment because they're deflecting rather than being present. I teach people to simply say, "Tell me more about how you experience that," instead of defending. The non-defense actually demonstrates innocence because you're open to the accusation rather than threatened by it. The psychological principle Watts identified: innocent people can afford to be curious about accusations. Guilty people must defend. So by not defending, you signal innocence more clearly than any defense could. By staying open, asking questions, exploring the accusation without fighting it, you demonstrate that you have nothing to hide. But here's the deeper layer. Sometimes you're not defending against the accusation. You're defending against your own doubt about yourself. Someone accuses you of being selfish, and you're not defending against their belief. You're defending against your own fear that maybe they're right. The vehemence of your defense is proportional to your own uncertainty. When you're solid in who you are, accusations bounce off without sticking, because there's no internal doubt for them to hook into. Watts would say this is why spiritual practice is practical. The more integrated you become, the more you've faced your own shadow, the less you need to defend against accusations. Even if they're partially true, you're not threatened by the truth. You can say, "Yeah, I can be selfish sometimes. Tell me about how you experienced that." No defense needed because you're not afraid of your own imperfections. The practical application is counterintuitive. When accused of something, resist the urge to immediately defend. Pause, feel into why you want to defend. Is it because the accusation is false or because you're insecure about that area? If you're insecure, no amount of defense will make you feel better. You'll just look guilty. If you're solid, you don't need defense. Try this instead. That's an interesting perspective. What led you to that conclusion? Or simply, "I see it differently, but I'm curious about your experience." Non-defense that invites dialogue rather than shutting it down with explanations. This approach signals confidence and openness rather than guilt and fear. Watts told a story about a Zen master accused of stealing. Instead of defending himself with alibis and explanations, he asked his accuser, "Did you lose something? Tell me about it." He stayed curious and present rather than defensive and reactive. Eventually, the real thief was discovered, and the Zen master's non-defense was remembered as a demonstration of his innocence. His refusal to defend proved his integrity more than any defense could have. This doesn't mean you never state your truth. It means you distinguish between calmly stating truth and defensively protecting your image. Truth doesn't need aggressive protection. Lies require constant defense. If you're speaking truth, you can speak it simply and then stop. No need for elaboration, justification, or proof. The truth is what it is. Your defense doesn't make it more true. Your non-defense doesn't make it less true. The liberated position Watts pointed to. Be so comfortable with your own truth that false accusations don't threaten you. Let guilty people defend themselves frantically. Let innocent people with unhealed shame defend themselves moderately. But you integrated, aware, at peace with your own shadow, you can simply exist without defense because you have nothing to prove to anyone, including yourself. Here's what Watts understood about power dynamics. Sometimes an attack isn't meant to be defended against. It's meant to be met with boundary, not explanation. This is a crucial distinction most people miss. When someone is testing your boundaries, they're not actually interested in your defense. They're interested in whether you have boundaries at all. They're pushing to see where the line is. Your defense, explaining, justifying, asking them to understand, actually signals that your boundaries are negotiable. It tells them there's room to push further. Watts observed this in his own life. People would sometimes push boundaries around his time, his energy, his teaching. If he defended his boundaries by explaining why he needed them, he inadvertently sent the message that his boundaries required justification, that if he could just explain well enough, they'd respect them. But boundary testers aren't looking for explanation. They're looking for firmness. The trap is this: you think you're defending your right to have boundaries, but defense suggests you need permission. Boundaries don't need permission. They don't need explanation. They don't need defense. They just need to be stated and maintained. One of Watts's students described this awakening. I had a friend who constantly asked me for favors, money, time, emotional support. Every time I wanted to say no, I'd defend my no. I can't because XYZ, but she'd argue with my reasons. But what about this solution? My defense gave her something to negotiate with. Then I learned from Watts to just say no, that doesn't work for me, with no explanation. She pushed back at first, why not? And I'd say, it just doesn't work for me. Eventually she stopped pushing because there was nothing to push against. My boundary became solid when I stopped defending it. This is dangerous because defending boundaries weakens them. Each time you explain or justify your boundary, you're implying that if your explanation isn't good enough, the boundary doesn't hold. You're teaching the other person that your boundaries are up for debate, and boundary testers will find flaws in every explanation you give because they're not actually listening to your reasons. They're testing whether you truly have a boundary or just a preference that can be negotiated away. Watts would point to nature as the teacher here. A mountain doesn't explain why it won't move. The ocean doesn't defend its tides. Boundaries in nature simply exist. They're not defensive. They're not apologetic. They're not seeking understanding. They just are. And when something hits a natural boundary, it either accepts the boundary or breaks itself against it. The psychological principle, boundary testing, is often unconscious. People aren't necessarily being malicious. They're often just seeing how much space they can take, where the edges are, what they can get away with. It's a natural human behavior, especially from people who don't have good boundaries themselves. But your response teaches them whether your boundaries are real or performative. A manager who studied Watts applied this at work. I had an employee who constantly pushed deadlines, negotiated project requirements, asked for exceptions. Every time I'd explain why the deadline or requirement mattered, but my explanations gave him ammunition to argue. What if I do X instead? I was defending policies that didn't need defense. Finally, I started responding differently. The deadline is Friday. But what if the deadline is Friday? No anger, no explanation, just clarity. After a few times of hitting a non-negotiable boundary, he stopped testing. The boundaries became real when I stopped defending them. Watts would say this is about presence versus reactivity. Defending is reactive. It means you feel attacked and you're protecting yourself. But boundaries aren't about protection, they're about definition. You're not protecting yourself from them. You're defining where you end and they begin. That definition doesn't require defense. It just requires clarity and consistency. But here's the subtle part Watts taught. People test boundaries because they want to find boundaries. Psychologically, we feel safer with people who have clear boundaries than with people who are porous and defensive. Someone with unclear boundaries is unpredictable, unreliable. Someone with clear boundaries is safe because you know where you stand. So when someone tests your boundaries, they're unconsciously asking, are you solid? Can I trust you? Will you hold the container? If you defend, you're saying, my boundaries are flexible, let's negotiate. If you simply maintain the boundary without defense, you're saying, I'm solid. You can push, but I won't move. That makes me safe. Children do this constantly with parents. They push boundaries not because they want the boundaries to collapse, but because they need to know the boundaries are real. The parent who defends every boundary rule with explanations raises an anxious child. The parent who simply maintains boundaries with calm firmness raises a secure child. The practical application. When someone pushes against your boundaries, notice your urge to explain or defend. Resist it. State the boundary simply. No, that doesn't work for me. I'm not available for that. If they ask why, you can say, it just doesn't work for me, or I'm not comfortable with that. But don't provide reasoning that can be argued with. Don't defend, don't justify, just maintain. This takes practice because we're trained to be polite, to explain ourselves, to make sure people understand our reasoning. But Watts would say this training actually weakens us. It makes our boundaries negotiable and teaches others that if they argue well enough, we'll cave. Real boundaries aren't up for debate. They're simply where we are. And here's the compassionate twist. By maintaining boundaries without defense, you're actually teaching others how to have boundaries. You're modeling what it looks like to be firm without being aggressive, to say no without needing to justify, to define yourself without needing approval. This is a gift, even if it doesn't feel like one in the moment. Watts's sixth insight draws from strategic wisdom. In competitive situations, defending yourself often means revealing your strategy, your thinking, your next move. This is particularly relevant in professional contexts, negotiations, conflicts where there's something at stake beyond just being right. Someone attacks your approach, your decision, your strategy. Your instinct is to defend it, to explain your reasoning, to justify your choice, to prove you thought it through. But in doing so, you're handing over your strategic advantage. Watts illustrated this with the ancient game of Go, which he loved. In Go, if your opponent questions why you placed a stone somewhere, the worst thing you can do is explain your strategy. Once they understand your plan, they can counter it. The master Go player responds to questions about their moves with silence or misdirection, never with honest explanation. Not because they're being deceptive, but because strategy revealed is strategy neutralized. The trap in modern life. Someone challenges your business decision, and you defend it by explaining your market analysis, your financial projections, your timeline. You think you're proving you made a good decision, but you've just given them a complete roadmap of your thinking. If they're a competitor, they now know how to counter you. If they're a manipulator, they now know what you value and how to manipulate those values. One of Watts's friends, a negotiation expert, described this. In any negotiation, the other side will sometimes attack your position to see how you defend it. They're not actually challenging you, they're gathering intelligence. If you defend by explaining your reasoning, you've shown them your priorities, your limits, your concerns. Now they know exactly where to apply pressure. Skilled negotiators either don't defend at all, that's our position, or they defend with information they want to reveal, not their actual thinking. This situation is dangerous because your ego wants to prove you're smart, thoughtful, strategic. When someone questions your judgment, you want to show them all the thinking that went into it. But in competitive or adversarial situations, proving you're smart means showing your intellectual hand. You're giving away information that has value. Watts would say this applies to personal relationships too, though more subtly. Sometimes in relationships, someone will challenge your choices not to understand you, but to map your decision-making process. They want to know what you value, what you fear, what you'll compromise on. If you defend every decision with full explanation, you're creating a psychological profile of yourself that can be used against you later. A woman who studied Watts's teachings described this in her divorce. My ex-husband's lawyer would attack every position I took in mediation. Why do you want the house? Why do you need that much support? Why are you asking for this custody arrangement? At first, I'd defend everything, explaining my reasoning in detail. Then I realized every explanation gave them information about my priorities, my fears, my bottom line. They weren't trying to understand. They were mapping my negotiation space. Once I stopped defending and just stated my positions, this is what I'm asking for, the process became simpler because they had less information to weaponize. The deeper pattern Watts identified: defense requires disclosure. You can't defend a position without revealing the assumptions, values, and logic underlying it. In situations where you're dealing with someone who might use that information strategically against you, defense is giving away power. But Watts wasn't advocating for paranoia or treating everyone as an adversary. He was teaching discernment. There are contexts where openness and explanation are appropriate and build trust. And there are contexts where strategic silence is necessary for your own protection. The wisdom is knowing which context you're in. The question to ask yourself: is this person asking to understand me or to find leverage against me? Are they curious, or are they mapping my territory for future attack? If it's the latter, explanation is not kindness, it's naivety. Watts told a story about a student who came to him with a conflict with their employer. The employer kept questioning the student's decisions in meetings, making them defend every choice. The student thought this was about proving their competence. Watts asked, "Or is your employer gathering information about how you think so they can predict and control you?" The student realized it was the latter. They stopped defending their decisions so elaborately and started simply stating outcomes. This is what I'm doing, and here are the metrics we'll use to evaluate it. The dynamic changed immediately, because there was less to grab onto. The practical application, in competitive or potentially adversarial context, distinguish between stating your position and defending your reasoning. You can state confidently what you're doing without explaining why. This is our approach, period. If pressed, you can give minimal information. We believe this serves the project best. But don't open up your strategic thinking for inspection unless you're certain it serves you to do so. This requires overriding a deep conditioning, the need to be understood, to be seen as reasonable, to have others agree with our logic. But Watts would say some contexts don't reward understanding. They reward strategic advantage. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is keep your strategy private until it's already succeeded. There's a Taoist principle Watts loved. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Similarly, the strategy that can be explained is not the most effective strategy. The moment you name it, explain it, defend it, it becomes vulnerable. Sometimes the most powerful approach is the one no one fully understands until it's already succeeded. Here's what Watts understood about integrity. Sometimes the only defense available requires you to compromise who you are. When that's the case, not defending is choosing integrity over vindication. This is one of the most psychologically sophisticated situations. You're accused of something. You could defend yourself, but the only effective defense would require you to throw someone else under the bus, reveal a confidence, compromise a value, or act in a way that contradicts who you want to be. You're caught between your reputation and your integrity. Watts taught that this is not actually a dilemma. It's a test, and the test is, what matters more, how others see you or how you see yourself? If you defend yourself by betraying your values, you win public vindication but lose self-respect. If you remain silent and accept the false accusation, you lose your reputation but maintain your integrity. Watts was clear about which was the higher choice. He illustrated this with Jesus' trial. Though Watts wasn't advocating Christianity, he was pointing to the psychological principle. Jesus could have defended himself in ways that would have saved his life by naming conspirators, by political maneuvering, by compromising his teachings, but every effective defense would have required him to betray what he stood for. So he remained silent, not from weakness, but from integrity. He chose to lose his life rather than lose himself. The trap in everyday life: you're accused of something at work. You could defend yourself by revealing that actually the problem was caused by a colleague. You'd be cleared, but you'd be betraying someone else. Or you're attacked for a decision you made, and you could defend it by revealing private information someone shared with you in confidence. You'd be vindicated, but you'd be untrustworthy. The defense is available, but the cost is your integrity. One of Watts's students, a therapist, described facing this. A client made a complaint against me that was based on a misunderstanding. I could have fully defended myself by revealing details of our sessions that would prove my innocence. But doing so would violate confidentiality and harm the client. So I accepted a professional reprimand I didn't deserve rather than defend myself in a way that would compromise my values. It was excruciating. But Watts's teaching held me. My relationship with my own integrity matters more than my professional reputation. I can live with being misunderstood. I can't live with being someone who betrays client trust to save myself. This situation is dangerous because the ego will rationalize any defense. I have to clear my name. It's not fair. Why should I suffer for someone else's mistake? All of these are true, and all of them miss the point. Fair or unfair, the question is, who do you want to be? Someone who maintains integrity under pressure, or someone who compromises integrity when it's convenient? Watts would say this is where character is forged. Anyone can have integrity when it's easy, when being honest and being advantageous align. But what do you do when they're in opposition? When the truth would harm you and the lie would help? When silence costs you reputation, but speaking costs you self-respect? This is the crucible. The deeper principle Watts taught: your relationship with yourself is more important than your relationship with anyone else. If you betray your values to defend your reputation, you damage the one relationship you can never escape, the one with yourself. You have to live with yourself every moment. Other people's opinions of you are external and changeable. Your opinion of yourself is internal and permanent. A businessman who studied Watts described this choice. A partner was embezzling from our company. I discovered it, but he was threatening to reveal something about my past that would destroy my marriage if I exposed him. I had to choose: defend my integrity by stopping the embezzling and potentially losing my marriage, or protect my marriage by staying silent about the embezzling. Watts's teaching was clear. I couldn't live with myself if I let the embezzling continue just to protect my secret. So I exposed it. And yes, my marriage went through hell, but I could look at myself in the mirror. I had chosen integrity over comfort. Watts would add this insight: often, when you choose integrity over defense, reality rewards you in unexpected ways. Not always, not immediately, but frequently. People who know you see that you could have defended yourself but chose not to, and they respect the integrity that choice represents. Or the truth eventually comes out, and your silence becomes evidence of your character. Or you simply develop an inner strength that comes from knowing you didn't betray yourself when pressure mounted. But even if none of that happens, even if you lose reputation, opportunities, relationships by refusing to defend yourself in ways that compromise your values, Watts would say you've won the only game that matters. You've maintained your integrity. You are who you want to be. That's not consolation, that's victory. The practical application: when faced with an accusation or attack, and you're considering how to defend yourself, ask, does my most effective defense require me to compromise my values? Would I need to betray a confidence, harm someone else, reveal information that should stay private, or act in ways that contradict who I want to be? If yes, don't defend. Take the hit to your reputation rather than taking the hit to your integrity. This doesn't mean you're a martyr or a victim. It means you've decided that some things are more important than being right or being understood. Your values are non-negotiable, even when defending them costs you something. Watts told a story about a friend who was accused of plagiarism. The friend could have defended himself by revealing that the accuser had actually stolen the work from someone else entirely. But revealing this would have exposed the actual victim who had asked for discretion. So his friend remained silent, accepted the accusation, and let his reputation be damaged. Years later, the truth came out through other means, and his silence was remembered as an act of profound integrity. But even if the truth had never emerged, Watts said his friend made the right choice. He chose to be trustworthy over being vindicated. The ultimate insight: your values are your values. They're not negotiable based on circumstances. If you'll betray them to defend yourself, they're not really your values. They're just preferences you hold when it's convenient. Real integrity means maintaining your values, especially when it costs you something. Watts's eighth insight touches on human psychology's shadow side. Some people can only feel good about themselves by making you wrong. Defending yourself feeds their need and prolongs your suffering. This is about people whose identity is built on being right, being superior, being the one who knows better. They don't attack you because of who you are. They attack you because they need someone to be wrong so they can be right. It's not personal. You're just the current projection screen for their need to feel superior. Watts called this the ego's relative game. The ego doesn't have inherent value, so it creates value by comparison. I'm smarter than you. I'm more moral than you. I'm more successful than you. The ego needs someone to be less than so it can be more than. If you defend yourself successfully, you take away their source of feeling superior, so they'll just find another angle to attack. The trap: you think if you defend yourself well enough, if you prove you're not wrong, they'll stop attacking. But you're misunderstanding the game. They don't actually care if you're wrong. They care that you're positioned as wrong so they can be positioned as right. Your defense just gives them new material to argue against, new ways to prove you're wrong, new opportunities to demonstrate their superiority. One of Watts's observations: I've noticed that with certain people, no matter how clearly I explain something, they find a way to misunderstand it in a way that makes them right and me wrong. At first, I thought I wasn't explaining well enough. Then I realized they need me to be wrong. My explanation isn't the problem. Their need is the problem. This situation is dangerous because you can spend years trying to get someone to see you accurately when they're psychologically invested in seeing you inaccurately. Every defense you mount is wasted energy because they're not listening to understand. They're listening to find flaws, to maintain their position of superiority, to feed their ego's need to be right. A teacher who studied Watts described this with a parent. My father needed me to be the failure so he could be the success. No matter what I accomplished, he'd find a way to diminish it, critique it, or explain how he would have done it better. For years I defended my choices, my accomplishments, my life. I thought if I could just explain well enough, he'd see me accurately. Then I realized he doesn't want to see me accurately. He needs me to be wrong so his own choices feel right. My defense was just giving him ammunition to maintain his position, so I stopped defending. When he'd critique, I'd say, "That's interesting," and change the subject. His attacks continued for a while, but without my defense to push against, they lost power. I stopped caring about his opinion because I realized it was never about me. It was about his need to be right. The psychological pattern Watts identified: these people are usually deeply insecure. Their need to make others wrong comes from their own fear of being wrong. If they can keep you in the wrong position, they never have to face their own inadequacies, mistakes, or limitations. Your wrongness is protecting them from their own self-doubt. But here's the compassionate insight Watts offered: you can't help them by defending yourself. In fact, your defense enables their pattern. Every time you defend and they find a way to still prove you wrong, they get a hit of superiority that reinforces the pattern. Your defense is actually feeding their psychological addiction. The most loving thing you can do, though it won't feel loving, is refuse to play. Don't defend, don't argue, don't try to prove you're right. Just step out of the game. I see you feel that way. That's your perspective. I understand we see this differently. Non-defensive responses that don't provide fuel for their need to be superior. This doesn't mean you agree with them. It means you refuse to participate in a game where someone has to be wrong for someone else to feel okay. Watts would say this is actually the more evolved position. You're comfortable enough with yourself that you don't need to prove you're right. You can let them have their perspective without needing to change it. A manager described applying this at work. I had an employee who constantly challenged my decisions, not to improve them, but to demonstrate that he knew better. Every time I'd defend a decision, he'd find some angle to argue. I finally realized he needs to be the smartest person in the room, so I stopped defending. That's an interesting perspective. Here's what we're doing. No debate, no defense, just clarity. He pushed back hard at first, but when I consistently refused to argue about who was right, the dynamic shifted. He eventually moved to another department where he could play that game with someone else. The practical application: identify people in your life who need you to be wrong. They're the ones where no matter how well you explain yourself, they find a way to misunderstand or critique. With these people, stop defending. You're not going to convince them you're right because they're not interested in accuracy. They're interested in maintaining their position of superiority. This takes tremendous self-control because the ego wants to prove itself. It feels unfair to be constantly misrepresented. But Watts would ask, what's more important, being understood by someone who's determined to misunderstand you or maintaining your own peace? You can't force someone to see you accurately if their identity depends on seeing you inaccurately. The liberating realization: you don't need everyone to understand you correctly. You don't need everyone to see your value. You don't need everyone to acknowledge your rightness. You only need to maintain your own clarity about who you are. Other people's need to see you as wrong is their problem, not yours. Let them have it. Their wrongness about you doesn't make it true. Here's what Watts understood about the power of framing. The moment you defend yourself against someone's accusation, you've accepted their framing of reality, and in their frame, you've already lost. This is perhaps the subtlest and most dangerous situation on this list. Someone accuses you of something using their conceptual framework, their definitions, their assumptions about reality. If you defend yourself within that framework, you're implicitly agreeing that their framework is valid. You're playing a game whose rules they've designed to ensure you lose. Watts illustrated this with a perfect example. Someone accuses you of being selfish for setting boundaries. If you defend yourself, "No, I'm not selfish, I do plenty for others," you've accepted their frame that setting boundaries is potentially selfish and needs to be justified by demonstrating your generosity. You've already lost because you're arguing within a paradigm where boundaries require defense. The liberated response is refusing the frame entirely. I don't accept that setting boundaries is selfish. That's not how I see it. You're not defending yourself within their framework. You're rejecting the framework itself. This trap is everywhere in modern discourse. Someone uses loaded language to describe your behavior or choices, and if you defend yourself using that same language, you've validated their framing. Are you saying you're not committed to equality? If you say, "Yes, I am committed to equality," you've accepted their definition of equality and their judgment that your behavior doesn't meet it. You're now arguing on their terms about whether you meet their standards. Watts would say the wise response is, "I don't accept your framing of this situation. Here's how I see it. You're not defending yourself. You're offering an alternative frame. You're refusing to play a game where the rules are designed to make you lose." One of Watts's students described this in a family conflict. "My mother accused me of abandoning the family by moving across the country for a job. If I'd defended within her frame, 'No, I'm not abandoning you. I'll visit, I'll call,' I would have accepted that moving for your career could be abandonment. Instead, I rejected the frame. I don't see moving for opportunity as abandonment. I see it as growing into my own life. I understand you're sad, but I don't accept that my growth is abandonment. She was angry, but I didn't defend myself within a framework that made my independence into betrayal. The danger here is that most framings are invisible. Someone uses language that contains assumptions, and you respond to the surface accusation without noticing the deeper framework. You're defending against what they said, while unconsciously accepting how they framed the entire situation. Watts gave an example from his own experience. Someone once asked him in a lecture, "Don't you think it's irresponsible to teach Eastern philosophy to Westerners who might misunderstand it?" The question contains multiple frames: that he's teaching rather than sharing, that misunderstanding is his responsibility, that Eastern philosophy is dangerous if misunderstood, that Westerners are particularly prone to misunderstanding it. If Watts had answered, "No, I'm very careful to explain things clearly," he would have accepted all those frames. Instead, he rejected them. "I don't see myself as teaching in the way you're suggesting. I'm exploring ideas with people who are interested. What they do with these ideas is their responsibility, not mine. And I don't accept that Eastern philosophy is more dangerous than Western philosophy if misunderstood." He refused the entire framework of the question. This situation is dangerous because accepting someone's frame is often invisible and automatic. They describe reality in a certain way, and you respond within that description without realizing you've just surrendered the power to define reality. Whoever controls the frame controls the outcome. A lawyer who studied Watts described this principle. In court, the side that gets to frame the case usually wins. If the prosecution frames the case as, "Did the defendant commit this crime?" and the defense argues within that frame, they're at a disadvantage. But if the defense can reframe it as, "Does the evidence prove beyond reasonable doubt what happened?" they've shifted the entire game. The defense that doesn't recognize framing battles are arguing within a frame designed to convict them. Watts's practical teaching: before you defend yourself, ask, what framework is this accusation based on? What assumptions does it contain? If I defend within this framework, do I validate assumptions I actually disagree with? Often you'll discover that the deepest problem isn't the accusation, it's the conceptual framework that makes the accusation possible. For example, someone accuses you of not being positive enough. If you defend, "I am positive, look at all these optimistic things I've said," you've accepted that positivity is a value you should be measured against. But maybe you don't agree that forced positivity is valuable. Maybe you think honesty is more important than positivity. Maybe you think their definition of positive is actually toxic positivity that denies reality. The non-defensive response: I don't share your belief that I should always be positive. I value authenticity over positivity. You're not defending your positivity level. You're rejecting positivity as the standard you should be measured against. The liberation here is profound. When you realize you don't have to defend yourself within other people's frameworks, you become free. You're not subject to every accusation that comes your way, because you can simply reject the premises the accusation is based on. You're not playing everyone else's games. You're defining reality for yourself. Watts told a story about being criticized for living on a houseboat rather than owning property. The criticism contained the frame that property ownership is more legitimate or stable than other living arrangements. Watts didn't defend his choice within that frame. Houseboats are actually very stable. He rejected the frame. I don't accept that owning property is more legitimate than other ways of living. I love living on water. Your preference for property ownership is your preference, not a universal standard I need to justify myself against. The practical application: develop the habit of noticing frames. When someone criticizes or attacks you, ask, what conceptual framework is this based on? What assumptions does it contain? Then decide, do I accept this framework or do I reject it? If you reject it, don't defend within it. Offer an alternative frame or simply state, I don't see it that way. This takes practice because we're so trained to answer the question we're asked. to defend against the accusation we're facing, to argue on the terms presented to us. But Watts would say, that's how you stay trapped in other people's realities. The free person recognizes frames and chooses which ones to accept. And sometimes the most powerful response is, I don't accept your framing of this situation. No defense, just refusal to play by rules you didn't agree to. Watts's final and deepest insight: sometimes an accusation, even if false or unfair, is carrying a lesson you need to learn. Defending yourself means missing the teaching. This is the most spiritually mature position on this list. Someone attacks you, accuses you, misunderstands you, and instead of immediately defending, you pause and ask, what might I learn from this? Even if they're wrong about the specifics, is there some truth I need to see? Is this mirroring something I need to understand about myself? Watts taught that reality is constantly teaching us, but we usually miss the lessons because we're too busy defending against them. Every uncomfortable experience, every criticism, every attack contains information. Not necessarily true information about what they're accusing you of, but information about you, about them, about the dynamics between you, about something that needs to shift. The trap is that defending yourself closes you to learning. When you're in defense mode, you're in resistance. You're fighting against what's happening rather than opening to what it might be showing you. Your defenses protect you from the attack, but they also protect you from the teaching. Watts described a powerful personal experience. Someone criticized him for being a spiritual teacher while still drinking alcohol. On the surface, this was judgment from someone who believed spiritual teachers should be ascetic. Watts could have defended himself by explaining his views on alcohol, Eastern versus Western spirituality, the difference between addiction and enjoyment, etc. But instead, he paused and asked, what am I meant to learn from this criticism? What he discovered was that he was, in fact, using alcohol more than he wanted to. The critic was wrong about spiritual teachers needing to be ascetic, but they'd unconsciously pointed to something real: Watts's own discomfort with his drinking. By not defending, by being open to the lesson beneath the accusation, he saw something he'd been avoiding about himself. This situation is dangerous because your ego's need to defend prevents your soul from growing. The ego doesn't want to learn. It wants to be right, to be safe, to be defended. The soul wants to evolve, which means being challenged, being uncomfortable, being wrong sometimes. When you automatically defend every accusation, you're serving your ego at the expense of your growth. One of Watts's students described this awakening. My partner accused me of being emotionally unavailable. My first response was defense. I'm not unavailable, I'm just busy with work. But something in me remembered Watts's teaching about not defending. So I sat with the accusation, and I realized even though she was wrong about the why, it wasn't about work. She was right about the what. I was emotionally unavailable. I'd been protecting myself from vulnerability by staying busy. Her accusation, even though she misunderstood the cause, pointed to a real issue I needed to address. If I'd defended, I would have missed that teaching. The psychological principle Watts identified: other people often see our blind spots before we do. They might not understand them correctly. They might judge them unfairly, but they're seeing something we're not seeing about ourselves. If we defend instead of inquiring, we stay blind. This doesn't mean every accusation contains a lesson. Sometimes people are completely wrong and projecting their own material. But Watts would say, you can't know which is which if you immediately defend. You have to pause, be open, inquire honestly. Might there be something true here that I need to see? This is the most advanced spiritual practice, treating every criticism as a potential teaching, not accepting every criticism as true, but being open to the possibility that even false accusations can point to true issues. The critic might be wrong about what they're criticizing you for, but right that something needs your attention. A therapist who studied Watts described applying this professionally. A client accused me of not caring about them. My professional ego wanted to defend, to point to all the ways I'd demonstrated care, the extra time I'd given, the energy I'd invested. But I used Watts's principle. I didn't defend. I asked myself, what might be true here? And I realized while I did care, I'd been somewhat distracted in our last few sessions by personal stress. I wasn't fully present. They were wrong that I didn't care, but right that something was off. By not defending, I could acknowledge what was actually true. You're right that I haven't been as fully present lately. I apologize. Tell me more about how you've experienced that. That honesty deepened our relationship in a way my defense would have prevented. Watts's teaching here is profound. The universe is always trying to show you where you need to grow, but it doesn't deliver lessons in tidy packages labeled, "Here's what you need to learn." It delivers them through difficult people, uncomfortable situations, unfair criticisms. If you defend against every uncomfortable thing, you block the universe's feedback system. The people who trigger you most strongly are often your greatest teachers, not because they're wise, but because they're poking at wounds that need healing, pointing to shadows that need integration, revealing patterns that need changing. Your defense protects the wound. Your openness allows the healing. The practical application is counterintuitive. When someone criticizes or attacks you, especially if it triggers a strong defensive response, that's a sign to pause and inquire. The stronger your urge to defend, the more likely there's something there to learn. Not necessarily what they're saying you should learn, but something. Try this practice. When accused or criticized, say to yourself, even if this person is completely wrong about their accusations, what might this situation be trying to teach me? Maybe it's teaching you about your own defensiveness. Maybe it's teaching you about boundary setting. Maybe it's teaching you about a real issue you've been avoiding. But there's always something to learn if you're willing to look beneath the surface accusation. Watts told a story about a Zen master who was falsely accused of fathering a child. Instead of defending himself, he simply took care of the child for years. When the truth eventually came out that he wasn't the father, someone asked why he didn't defend himself. He said, "The accusation taught me about my own attachment to reputation. Caring for the child taught me about unconditional service. If I'd defended myself, I would have missed both lessons." The ultimate insight: every experience is here to evolve you. Comfortable experiences evolve you slowly. Uncomfortable experiences evolve you quickly. Accusations and attacks are uncomfortable experiences that carry potent evolutionary potential. If you don't defend against them, if you're willing to inquire into what they're showing you about yourself, about others, about reality, this doesn't mean you're a doormat. It doesn't mean you accept every criticism as valid. It means you're mature enough to pause before defending, to ask what might be useful in even unfair criticism, to use difficult experiences as fuel for growth, rather than as evidence that you're under attack. Watts's final teaching on this: the ego wants to be defended. The self wants to be free. Every time you choose inquiry over defense, you're choosing freedom over protection, growth over safety, evolution over stagnation. Let me synthesize Watts's complete picture of the 10 dangerous situations where you must never defend yourself. When someone is projecting their shadow onto you, your defense validates their projection and makes it more real. Let the projection pass through you without participating in it. When someone is trying to pull you into their drama, they need conflict, not resolution. Your defense feeds their drama addiction. Refuse to be their opponent. When defending reveals information you should protect, some defenses cost more than the accusation. Strategic silence is often wiser than transparent explanation. When your defense makes you look guilty, excessive defense signals there's something to defend. True innocence has a quality of openness rather than desperation. When someone is testing your boundaries, boundaries don't need explanation or defense. They just need to be clearly stated and consistently maintained. When you're being baited into revealing your strategy in competitive contexts, defending yourself often means showing your hand. Silence can be strategic power. When defending requires betraying your values, your integrity matters more than your reputation. Choose who you are over how you're seen. When someone needs you to be wrong to feel right, you can't win a game where your wrongness is necessary for their psychological well-being. Refuse to play. When defending means accepting their frame, the moment you defend within someone's framework, you validated their framing of reality. Sometimes you need to reject the entire paradigm. When defense would mean missing the lesson. Even false accusations can carry true teachings. Being open to learning is more valuable than being right. This isn't about becoming passive or allowing abuse. It's about developing the wisdom to know when defense helps and when it harms. It's about recognizing that the ego's automatic defense impulse often makes situations worse, not better. It's about choosing strategic silence over reactive explanation, integrity over vindication, learning over winning. Watts believed that most suffering comes from defending an illusory self, the ego, against attacks that wouldn't matter if you weren't so identified with the ego. The more you realize your true nature as something beyond the ego, the less you need to defend anything. Attacks pass through you like arrows through empty space. There's nothing there to defend because you're not the separate, vulnerable, attackable thing you thought you were. This is the ultimate freedom, not needing to defend yourself because you've realized there's no separate self that requires defending. You're not a fortress under siege. You're the space in which both attacks and defenses arise and pass away, touching nothing essential about what you truly are. If you've been exhausting yourself defending against every attack, every criticism, every misunderstanding, Watts would want you to know you don't have to defend yourself nearly as much as you think you do. Most of what you're defending is the ego, the image of yourself you want to maintain, the reputation you're trying to protect, the identity you're afraid of losing. But you are not your ego. You are not your reputation. You are not what other people think about you. You're the consciousness that witnesses all of it, and consciousness doesn't need defending. This doesn't mean you never clarify misunderstandings or set boundaries or speak your truth. It means you develop discernment about when defense serves you and when it imprisons you. It means you learn to recognize the 10 situations where defending yourself actually makes things worse. You're not weak for not defending yourself. You're wise. You're not a doormat for letting false accusations stand. You're free from the need to control others' perceptions. You're not losing by refusing to play games you can't win. You're winning by refusing to play. The people who need you to defend yourself are usually serving their own psychological needs to feel superior, to maintain drama, to avoid their own shadows. You don't have to participate in other people's psychological processes. You're not obligated to defend yourself just because someone attacks you. Let yourself be misunderstood sometimes. Let yourself be falsely accused occasionally. Let yourself lose arguments you could win if winning requires compromising your values or feeding dynamics that harm you. Let yourself be open to learning from even unfair criticism. Let yourself be free from the exhausting need to defend every aspect of your existence. Your worth doesn't depend on successfully defending yourself against every attack. Your value doesn't require constant proof and explanation. Your truth doesn't need aggressive protection. You can simply be who you are and let others think what they will. This is the peace Watts pointed to. Not having to defend yourself because you're not attached to the self that needs defending. You're free, truly deeply free. You are not your reputation. You are not others' perceptions of you. You are not the ego that feels constantly under attack. You are the witnessing awareness in which all of this drama arises and passes away. If you want to explore more of Allan Watts' insights for living freely in a world that constantly demands you defend yourself, subscribe to this channel where I decode his teachings for people trying to find peace in a confrontational culture. Watch the video on your screen now about Watts' teaching on the illusory ego and how realizing your true nature ends the need for self-defense. Remember what Watts taught. You are the universe experiencing itself subjectively. How could such vastness need defending? Stop defending the small self. Start recognizing the vast self. The attacks you're defending against are hitting a target that isn't really there. When you realize this, not intellectually but experientially, defense becomes unnecessary, not because you're invulnerable, but because there's nothing there to wound. The greatest protection isn't a strong defense, it's the realization that what you truly are cannot be attacked. That's not philosophy, that's liberation.